Well, hello there from Australia. Um, it's David Hopkins here. Holla to you in Uruguay. We're going to be talking about the Australian lamb industry and the development of it over the last 30 or so years, um, and some of the changes that have taken place. Just for some context, I currently live in Canberra, which is the capital of Australia. And I did formerly work amongst places at Cowra there, which is shown on the map. That's in the central west of New South Wales, in a very strong lamb producing area. If we look at the Australian lamb industry, and we go back to the 80s really to get the context, consumption peaked at around about 30 kilograms per head. And then it declined to 15 or 16 kilograms per head. And part of this decline stimulated a major consumer survey to be undertaken. And what happened in that survey was that lamb was sent back to households in two major cities of Australia for consumers to actually cook, eat, and then give the feedback. And fundamentally, the feedback that came back from the consumers was that lamb was just too fat, too much bone, and it lacked versatility. And really, at that time, it was a byproduct of the wool industry. Now, in the 90s, the industry was valued at about $1 billion. Today, it is in the order of magnitude of billions of dollars. And so we're going to look at the evolution of this industry. Back then, the emphasis was put on an R&D program to lift the weight of slaughtered lamb while reducing fatness. And the issue that came out of that, of course, with the consumers was the over-fatness. But there was also the emerging North American market where they wanted leaner, larger lambs. And so the emphasis in Australia was put on genetics and management to lift the carcass weight and also to try and control fatness. And so genetics and management were the initial focus of the R&D program. Now, of course, what happened with that simultaneously was the development of genetic improvement systems in Australia. And this enabled this genetic improvement to become a reality through the launch of LambPlan. It's the national performance recording system for sheep meat. So all stud producers who desire to have their animals objectively measured can enter that program for a cost and then get the genetic merit of their particular stock and use that in their own decisions for breeding, but also in the sale of their sires into the industry. Now, coupled with that, Australia also had a unique production system that utilised hybrid vigor and crossbred lambs. And this is a diagram of that production system as it still exists today, and it sort of underpins the Australian sheep meat industry. So at the left top, we have the merino by merino. The merino is the largest base ewe of the flock in Australia. And from that joining, we often get wether lambs, which end up in the meat market as lambs for the meat market. Now, some of those merino ewes will be joined, they will be sold, cull merino ewes might be joined to terminal sires, and they produce first cross lambs, which are an ideal lamb for the meat market. But further to that, some of those merino ewes will actually be joined also to maternal sires. So we're talking about Border Leicesters particularly, and those animals then produce first cross ewe lambs. These are often joined to terminal sires, and they produce second cross lambs, and they have like very high hybrid vigor, and they're also particularly fertile. But out of that crossing system, we also get merino ewes that are crossed to maternal sires. So we get first cross wethers. So we have these different sources of production of meat animals. And so with the focus of the terminal sires on the selection for growth and muscling and fat, it enabled genetic improvement to flow through into the general sheep industry. Now, with a colleague geneticist, Neil Fogarty, back in sort of the late 90s, I guess, we did a large study looking at different types of genotypes in Australia. I mean, there's about 3,000 lambs in this study, and we did extensive, we slaughtered all of them, but we did extensive investigation of meat quality traits on about 600 of them. But you can see from these results that the terminal sire by the first cross ewe lamb produces the heaviest carcass. Again, it's the hybrid vigor. And we go right down to the merino by merino, which produces the lightest. So this enables flexibility in production. So the benefits of crossbreeding, of course, you get faster growth rates to slaughter. It increases the scope to reach target slaughter weights and improve carcass characteristics because you've got this genetic focus on the sires. And it allows the base ewe flock to be improved for other traits like wool and reproduction. So you can focus on those in the merinos, in the border Leicester merinos, those traits, but then have the focus for the meat traits, particularly on the terminal sires. Now, we know that, you know, merinos suit particular types of country. That's the way they are. And, you know, they produce wool in those situations. These are some animals that we bred as a part of one of our large studies at Cowra. And this shows you the sites of crossbred animals that can actually be produced. These are a mix of different genotypes, and these were assessed in a major work. So genetic improvement, and the 3 genetic breeding values, they're called now Australian breeding values for terminal breeds, and they are muscle depth, fat depth, and growth. And they were the original focus of Lamplin. And basically, with this tool, as I've said, it enables breeders to actually assess the genetic potential of their flock, particularly their sires and also their dams, and then benchmark their flocks with other flocks. So to obtain, obviously, these breeding values, you need to actually measure the live animal, in this case, muscle depth and fatness. And these are measured by using ultrasound. And originally, when the scheme started, the ultrasound systems were what we call A mode, so like a Doppler effect. And there was an issue with this because you couldn't actually see what you're actually measuring. You're relying on the transmission of sound. And I published a paper there in 1990 to actually unravel this. And at the time when I did this, you'd have to say that I wasn't the favorite with the geneticists because I was casting doubt on the accuracy of their data. But as technology develops, the move was made to B-mode machines. This is real time where you can actually see the tissue boundaries, and it helps you to better discriminate between muscle levels and fat levels. So these ASBVs, they're generated from data from the pedigree also, and genomic information, which has actually been collected now as a part of the overriding body, looks after genetics, called sheep genetics. And this again enables prediction of genetic merit. And it's led to significant changes in the average carcass weight of slaughtered lambs in Australia. And this is shown in this graph here, going from 2010, projecting into next year to 2023. And on the right-hand side, you can see the average kilogram carcass weight of slaughtered lambs in Australia. And now we're up in the sort of the region of 24.5 kilos. So there's been a huge change. And if we go back before 2010, then the average carcass weight was much lighter. We can also see that production is projected to increase again. It's sort of stabilized there. We went through sort of the COVID pandemic with some reduction, and also some reduction in the sheep flock due to various environmental effects. But when we look at the progress genetically, we can see that this approach to actually having a national genetic performance recording system actually makes changes. And here we've got sort of average ASBVs across the 3 major groups. We've got the terminal sires in the grey, we've got the merinos, and we've got the maternals. And you can see that they're all, excuse me, they're all on an upward projection from way back in the year 2000. So we're making genetic changes. And as I said, the carcass weight back in the order of 17.5 kilos back in the 90s, now 25 kilos on average in 2022. But one of the issues was that the original focus did not include meat quality traits. And again, no friend of the geneticists, in 2005, as a part of a major study with collaborative groups across Australia, we published a paper which looked at the effect of the post-weaning muscle depth EBV, the PEMD, on eating quality traits. Now, this was the first data out of Australia to actually look at what was actually happening to consumer-assessed eating quality. So the tenderness, the juiciness, and the overall liking are not actually from an objective machine. They're from real-time consumers off the street. And essentially what you see is that the breeding value for muscling, as it increases, the tenderness, the juiciness, and the overall liking, which are correlated, all go down. So the message was simple. We cannot afford to just focus on increasing carcass weight and reducing fatness and ignore the meat quality traits. And what this has done is it's led to a focus on meat quality traits and the generation of heritabilities and production of genomic breeding values since that time, and it continues today. Now, this is actually shown by the genetics data itself from Lampland. You can see the genetic trends, and this just simply reinforces what we found in 2005. And you can see that intramuscular fat, which is the grey line, actually has been declining. And the overall liking, which is the blue line at the bottom, has been showing an even bigger decline. So we're driving down eating quality if we persist to only focus on increasing carcass weight. Sure, we increase lean meat yield because it's correlated with carcass weight. And you can see an interesting trend now with shear force. So shear force is an objective measurement of how tough or tender a piece of meat is. And you can see it was going up too, which is what we would expect as eating quality goes down. But you can see it started to stabilize. And part of this is now the reconnection or recorrection, in the industry in terms of breeding values, with the focus not solely being on carcass weight. So there you go. IMF was decreasing, evidence that with muscling, we're actually decreasing eating quality. Now, this sort of was linked in with a major collaborative study that was undertaken over 5 years in Australia called the Sheep CRC, Cooperative Research Centre. And this involved these particular organisations, all effectively managing 1,000 sheep, 1,000 ewes at their particular research stations. And these ewes were all joined to 100 sires by AI, so common sires across each geographic and production zone, to produce in the order of 10,000 lambs over the 5 years of the CRC. So 5,000 ewes across 8 sites, joined to approximately 100 sires each year for 5 years, produce about 10,000 slaughter lambs. So a massive database. And in that database and in those animals, we measured approximately 30 meat traits. This included things like mineral composition, iron and zinc, omega-3s, shear force, pH, meat color, and even some eating quality using real-time consumers. This shows you some of the progeny that we bred at a Cowra site. The Cowra site, excuse me, had 500 ewes, and we had 500 ewes at our Trangie site in far central western New South Wales. I oversaw these 2 flocks with then 2 scientists who were responsible for the day-to-day management of the flocks. But you can see that we've produced impressive animals. And these are some of the slaughter lambs that we produced at our Trangie research station, which, as I said, is in the far central west of New South Wales. This is in the dry cropping pastoral zone. And these animals here, they were slaughtered at around about 4 months of age and had average carcass weights of 30 kilograms. So they are a mix of first and second cross lambs coming out of merino and first cross ewes. But you can see these are impressive animals. And so with the genetic improvement you can actually do a lot. Other traits were measured: wool, reproduction, parasites, and so on. But out of that program was the emergence of what we call genomic breeding values. And they've now been released into the industry for lean meat yield, intramuscular fat, dressing percentage, and shear force. So breeders can take a blood sample, they can submit it for testing, and that will then be used through the database to produce genomic breeding values for their animals for those traits. And to give you an example, you can see an output of the system here. So we've got ASBVs as the trait. We've got the accuracy, which is the ACC at the bottom. And you can see here for this particular animal, as you go across, its lean meat yield percentage or breeding value is 2.4. So it's above the average of all the sires. So in other words, progeny from that particular sire would on average produce more lean meat yield than others. But as you can see, there is a reduction potentially in intramuscular fat, and also further an increase in shear force. Muscle depth, of course, has gone up because it's the lean meat yield is pointing up to, and we can see that the animal is actually leaner than average. So what you need to do with this type of information to make sure that you don't go off on tangents in your breeding objective is to combine this into an index with specific weightings. And you can watch those two, go to those two websites there, and you can have a look at further information on this process. So breeding objectives and genomics, to do this effectively, the limitation is that you need reference flocks to keep verifying those genomic breeding values. There's been some uptake of this in the stud sector, for sure. It does require a blood test and DNA analysis. But it's suggested that genetic gain can be increased by about 20% for the hard-to-measure traits that previously we couldn't even measure. We didn't know what a sire would do in terms of its progeny and things like intramuscular fat. So it's opened up a whole new spectrum of being able to provide more sophisticated breeding applications. If you think about it, we've captured the hybrid vigor. The genetic improvement for the terminal breeds, I think I've shown, is highly effective. We just need to actually monitor that. And you can then set up the appropriate breeding objectives. We did in the Australian industry also, in the endeavour to increase carcass weights, we did look extensively at the use of cryptorganism. But really what that did was it stimulated breeders to take on more and more genetic improvement. And the concept of entires or partial entires hasn't really persisted in Australia for a number of reasons. Now, it's all very well to have genetic improvement, excuse me, but you need also feeding systems that have got to be able to match the genetics. So if you have an increased genetic capacity for growth, you've got to be able to feed those. And in Australia, that could include intensive feedlotting. But a lot of our lamb is produced extensively. In this case, this is a photo from Cowra of lambs on alfalfa or lucerne, which is extensively used through the Central West. But other areas of Australia are permanent pastures, ryegrass, fescues, clovers. But we also do have a feedlot industry, particularly focused on animals like merinos, which need a bit of extra input to actually get them up to suitable slaughter weights. Of course, you need to control diseases in any production system, and that's particularly important and becoming more important as these are being monitored, excuse me, more extensively at the slaughter process. Now, of course, to make the most of this technology, these advancements, it's really beneficial to be able to actually monitor the growth of your individual lambs. And here's a system that's used here. This system allows a 5-way draft. You can draft according to particular selection criteria. It also allows you to enter data, for instance, on fat levels, palpated fat levels, which you can monitor then the individual performance of each and every one of your lambs. Now, to make that system really flow, you need electronic ear tags so that individual animals can be managed. And then also at the abattoir now, you can get individual feedback on each lamb using these electronic ear tags. And the use of electronic ear tags is now going to be compulsory in New South Wales for both sheep and goats. Now, another thing that was happening at that time with the lamb industry was the development of a new range of cuts. And these were called the trim lamb cuts. And they were specifically developed for carcasses between 18 and 22 kilograms and fat score 2 or 3. Training programs and cooking guides were developed, but the idea was to respond to that early information which said that lamb lacked versatility, was to provide new cuts. And so here we have a breakdown of a carcass, and we can see some of the cuts that have emerged. And for instance, in this diagram, you can see the lamb knuckle. Now, that cut today is actually sold retail in Australia. It has as a re-emergence since this program in the 90s, and is back on the market now. This is the forequarter. The forequarter cuts probably at the time were less developed in terms of value adding than what we would actually see now in the industry. And this was some of the original types of cuts. You can see here, you can see lamb knuckles, for instance. You can see other cuts. And the idea was that these were heavily trimmed, very low levels of fat, and many of the cuts without bone. So to give much more versatility and to provide protein instead of waste products. Now, what's happened is that packaging systems that have been developed have led to the re-emergence of trim lamb cuts. A lot of those cuts suffered from oxidation when they were displayed in the sort of traditional butcher display. But now with the emergence of new packaging systems, we've got a re-emergence of these cuts because we can overcome the oxidation issues. Now, the other interesting thing is, of course, that the major demographic in Australia now is actually 1 to 2 person households, and they demand easier to cook cuts. So this again has stimulated a re-emergence of these trim lamb cuts. But what it did do is also created pressure to develop new forequarter cuts. And the reason for that is that lamb is competing with other protein sources, and they're capturing market share. Chicken, for instance, growing a market share. Turkey here, specialist on the right, protein source. But consumers are showing a preference for smaller portions also, in reflection of the major demographic of 1 to 2 person households. So the cut on the left, that weighs something in the order of, I think it's 1.7 kilos or something, is actually too heavy for many households. The lamb rumps on the other side, 700 grams. So more ideal, and in this case, packed, ready to be cooked, and then served, and would be ideal for a 2 person household. And of course, the increased carcass weights that we've continued to produce, and we continue to produce, as you've seen by the graph, means that cut weights go up. So we've got to do something, excuse me, with those cuts. And here you can see some data that we collected, looking at this to try and get a better handle on what was an ideal roast weight. And here we've got different household sizes going from 1 up to 6, and the frequency of shopping. But the underlying message from this is that for the 1 and 2 household sizes, basically, you need cuts, roast cuts that are sort of no more, certainly, than 1.5 kilos, but not even probably that heavy. So this demands a change. And as a consequence of that, one of the things that we did in the program and in our team at Cara was we developed a new cut called the compact shoulder roast. And it's prepared basically from the forequarter. And this gives you the cutting specifications for how that would actually be produced. Now, this particular cut actually stimulated a lot of interest at the time, but industry was also in the process of changing. And so we now see a vast array of different sorts of forequarter cuts on the market through the major supermarkets. So finally, just to give you some information on the Australian lamb industry, the national flocks at the moment is around 68 million. It has been well above 100 million in the past, and approximately 38 million of those are breeding ewes. There are about 22 million lambs slaughtered in Australia in 2021 to 2022, and the average carcass weight for that period was over 24 kilos. But, you know, we export now more than 50% of our product from what was 22% in 1994. And our largest export markets are China, the US, the Middle East, and South Korea. And it's been the growth in the export market which has really continued, and given it's really underpinned the Australian lamb industry, and the growth in the value of the industry that's continued. And there's no sign that that is actually going to abate. So thank you very much. Gracias, and all the best.